August 24th, 1942. Dawn breaking over Henderson Field, Guadalcanal. Lieutenant Junichi Sasai stood beside his Mitsubishi, a 6M20, serial number 5178, watching the morning mist rise from the jungle canopy as he prepared for what should have been another routine combat air patrol over the Solomon Islands. His crew chief, Petty Officer Yamada, had spent the previous evening meticulously cleaning the twin 7.7mm machine guns and checking the 60 rounds loaded into each of the 20mm cannons, the weapons that had made the Zero the terror of the Pacific skies for nearly 2 years. Sasai, with 56 confirmed victories since his first combat mission over Chongqing in 1938, had never lost a dogfight to an American fighter, having shot down 7 Brewster Buffaloes over Java, 4 P-40 Warhawks over Darwin, and just 2 weeks earlier, 3 of the stubby Grumman F-4F Wildcats that the Americans insisted on throwing against the Imperial Japanese Navy's finest warriors. The intelligence briefing that morning at Rabaul had been almost dismissive in its assessment of American fighter strength at Guadalcanal. Captain Toshiyuki Yokoyama, reading from the latest reconnaissance reports, announced that the Marine Fighter Squadron operating from the captured airfield possessed no more than 12 to 15 operational Wildcats, those same inferior machines that Japanese pilots had been shooting down at will since the war's opening days. Aircraft that weighed 2,000 pounds more than the nimble Zero turned like cargo ships compared to the Zero's ability to pivot on its wingtip, and climbed so slowly that Japanese pilots often joked about having time to smoke a cigarette while waiting for the Americans to reach altitude. What Sasai didn't know, what none of the 18 Zero pilots preparing for the escort mission to Guadalcanal realized, was that in precisely 4 hours and 17 minutes, he would encounter a tactical innovation so simple yet so devastating that it would begin the systematic unraveling of Japanese air superiority in the Pacific. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The mission seemed routine as Sasai led his squadron south from Rabaul at 21,000 feet, escorting 27 Mitsubishi G-4M bombers toward their target, the American positions around Henderson Field. The morning sun painted their dark green aircraft in sharp relief against the crystal blue Pacific sky, and Sasai felt the familiar calm that came with absolute confidence in his machine and his abilities. The Zero beneath him responded to the slightest pressure on the stick, dancing through the air with an elegance that no American fighter could match, its Nakajima Sakai 12 engine purring smoothly at 70% power, consuming fuel at a rate that would allow him to remain over the target area for nearly 2 hours while the Wildcats, with their thirsty Pratt & Whitney engines, would be forced to land and refuel after 30 minutes of combat. The first indication that something was different came at 11:43 when Sasai spotted 8 Wildcats climbing from the southeast, their distinctive stubby silhouettes unmistakable even at distance. But instead of climbing straight toward the Japanese formation as they usually did, trying desperately to reach altitude before the Zeros could dive on them, these Wildcats were maintaining a strange formation, flying in pairs with about 200 yards separation between aircraft, weaving gently back and forth as they climbed. Sasai smiled beneath his flying goggles, thinking the Americans were already maneuvering defensively before the battle had even begun, showing their fear of the Zero's superiority. He waggled his wings to signal the attack, watching as his pilots peeled off in pairs to engage the climbing Wildcats, each Japanese pilot selecting his target with the precision of a master swordsman choosing his strike. What happened next would haunt Sasai for the rest of his life, becoming the subject of heated debates in Japanese naval aviation circles, and ultimately contributing to a complete revision of fighter tactics throughout the Imperial Navy. As Sasai dove on the trailing Wildcat in the formation, lining up what should have been an easy deflection shot, the American fighter suddenly broke hard left toward its wingman, who was also under attack from Sasai's own wingman, Lieutenant Kazuo Tsunoda. The 2 Wildcats crossed paths in what appeared to be a collision course, their wings nearly touching as they passed, forcing both Sasai and Tsunoda to pull up sharply to avoid the intersecting aircraft. But as they climbed away, both Japanese pilots found themselves suddenly looking at the noses of 2 Wildcats that had reversed their turns and were now firing their 650 caliber machine guns directly at them. The volume of fire was staggering. Sasai's Zero shuddered as several rounds punched through his port wing, one bullet passing so close to his head that it shattered his canopy frame, sending plexiglass fragments into the cockpit. He rolled desperately right, using the Zero's superior roll rate to escape the cone of tracers. But as he did, he saw Tsunoda's Zero take multiple hits in the engine cowling, black smoke beginning to stream from the Nakajima engine as oil sprayed across the windscreen. Tsunoda managed to disengage, diving away toward the ocean, but his Zero would never make it back to Rabaul, forcing him to ditch 20 miles north of Guadalcanal, where he would spend 18 hours in his life raft before being rescued by a Japanese destroyer. The engagement continued for 22 minutes, the longest aerial battle Sasai had experienced since the war began, and throughout it all, the American Wildcats maintained their strange weaving pattern, each pair of fighters protecting the other in a coordinated dance that made it impossible for the Japanese pilots to maintain an attack for more than a few seconds without exposing themselves to defensive fire. Every time a Zero achieved a favorable position on one Wildcat's tail, the American pilot would turn toward his wingman, who would simultaneously turn toward him, creating a scissors maneuver that forced the attacking Zero to either break off or fly directly into the guns of the second Wildcat. Lieutenant Kenji Okabe, flying as Sasai's second element lead, managed to damage one Wildcat with a lucky burst from his 20mm cannons at maximum range, but as he pressed his attack, trying to finish off the wounded American fighter, its wingman executed a barrel roll that brought it directly behind Okabe's Zero. The American pilot fired a long burst that walked up the Zero's fuselage from tail to cockpit, and Okabe's fighter exploded in a ball of orange flame, the unprotected fuel tanks that gave the Zero its incredible range becoming a funeral pyre falling toward the sea. The loss of Okabe, one of the squadron's most experienced pilots with 31 victories, sent a shock through the Japanese formation, and several pilots began to question whether these were the same Wildcats they had been dominating for months. The tactical innovation the Japanese pilots were encountering had been developed thousands of miles away in a small office at Naval Air Station San Diego, where Lieutenant Commander John Smith Thach had spent countless hours studying combat reports from the early Pacific battles, moving matchsticks across his desk like chess pieces, searching for a way to neutralize the Zero's overwhelming performance advantages. Thach understood that in a traditional one-on-one dogfight, the Wildcat would lose every time. The Zero could outturn it, outclimb it, and outrun it in most flight regimes. But Thach also recognized that the Zero's advantages were predicated on single combat, on the assumption that aerial battles would be fought as a series of individual duels, where the superior aircraft would inevitably prevail. The solution Thach developed, initially called the beam defense position, but soon known throughout the fleet as the Thach weave, was revolutionary in its simplicity. Two fighters would fly in a loose formation, separated by enough distance that they could see each other clearly but not so close that they would interfere with each other's maneuvering. When attacked, instead of both planes turning away from the threat or trying to outmaneuver the attacker individually, they would turn toward each other, crossing paths while maintaining visual contact. The attacking aircraft would be forced to choose which target to follow, and regardless of its choice, it would inevitably expose itself to the guns of the other fighter. The beauty of the tactic lay in its exploitation of the Zero's greatest strength, its exceptional maneuverability. The very agility that allowed the Zero to get on an enemy's tail so quickly also meant that it could follow the initial target through the weaving turn. But in doing so, the Japanese pilot would present a perfect shot to the second Wildcat. If the Zero pilot recognized the trap and tried to disengage, both Wildcats could reverse their turns and pursue, maintaining their mutual support while preventing the Japanese pilot from using his superior performance to escape. The development of the Thach weave had not been without skeptics. Rear Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher, commanding the Yorktown Task Force, had initially been dubious about the tactic, concerned that it required too much coordination between pilots and that it might break down under the stress of combat. But Thach had persisted, drilling his pilots relentlessly in the maneuver, first in training flights over San Diego, then in combat exercises with other Navy squadrons. His wingman, Ensign Robert A.M. Dibb, had become so proficient at the weave that he could execute it almost instinctively, turning toward Thach at the exact moment needed to create the deadly crossfire that would trap attacking aircraft. The first combat test of the Thach weave had come at the Battle of Midway on June 4, 1942, when Thach's division of 6 Wildcats, escorting the obsolete Douglas TBD Devastator torpedo bombers of VT-3, had been jumped by approximately 20 Zeros from the Japanese carriers Akagi and Kaga. The Japanese pilots, veterans of Pearl Harbor and the Indian Ocean raids, had attacked with complete confidence, expecting to scatter the American fighters like chaff before the wind. Instead, they encountered something entirely unexpected. Wildcats that refused to fight on Japanese terms, that turned toward danger instead of away from it, that created interlocking fields of fire that no amount of aerobatic skill could penetrate safely. In that engagement over Midway, Thach and his 5 pilots had faced odds of nearly 4-1, yet they had not only survived but had shot down several Zeros while losing only one of their own, and that loss had come when the pilot broke formation to chase a damaged Japanese aircraft. The success had been remarkable enough that Admiral Chester Nimitz himself had requested a detailed report on the tactic, which was then distributed throughout the Pacific Fleet, with orders that all fighter squadrons begin immediate training in the Thach weave. By August 1942, when Sasai encountered it over Guadalcanal, the Thach weave had become standard doctrine for Marine and Navy Wildcat pilots throughout the Pacific theater. Major John L. Smith, commanding Marine Fighter Squadron 223 at Henderson Field, had drilled his pilots extensively in the tactic, recognizing that it was their only hope of survival against the technically superior Zeros. Smith, who would become the Marine Corps' leading ace of the Guadalcanal campaign with 19 victories, had modified the weave slightly to accommodate the unique conditions at Henderson Field, where pilots often had to take off under fire and form up while already under attack. The psychological impact on Japanese pilots encountering the Thach weave for the first time was profound. Lieutenant Takeyoshi Ono, flying his first combat mission over Guadalcanal that August morning, later wrote in a letter to his wife that he felt as if the rules of nature had been reversed, as if water was flowing uphill or the sun was rising in the west. Everything he had been taught at the Kasumigura Naval Air Training Center about aerial combat, every instinct developed through hundreds of hours of training, told him that when he achieved position on an enemy's tail, victory was assured. Yet here were American pilots who seemed to welcome being attacked, who turned toward danger with an eagerness that defied logic, who had somehow transformed defense into offense. The frustration was particularly acute for veteran pilots like Sasai, who had spent years perfecting their craft, learning to exploit every aspect of the Zero's performance envelope, the complex aerobatic maneuvers they had mastered, the energy management techniques that allowed them to maintain speed through violent maneuvering, the deflection shooting skills that enabled them to hit targets at seemingly impossible angles. All of it was rendered irrelevant by 2 Wildcats flying back and forth in a simple weaving pattern. It was as if years of sword training had been negated by an opponent who refused to draw his blade, who instead fought with a completely different weapon that followed completely different rules. The technical specifications of the 2 aircraft told a story that should have guaranteed Japanese victory in every engagement. The Mitsubishi A6M20 Model 21 that Sasai flew weighed just 5,555 pounds fully loaded, while the Grumman F4F4 Wildcat weighed 7,426 pounds. The Zero's power-to-weight ratio gave it a climb rate of 3,000 feet per minute, while the Wildcat struggled to achieve 2,000 feet per minute. In a horizontal turn at medium altitude, the Zero could complete a full circle in 17 seconds, with a radius of 612 feet, while the Wildcat needed 23 seconds and a radius of 900 feet. The Zero's armament, while lighter than the Wildcat's 650 caliber machine guns, was considered more than adequate for destroying enemy fighters. The 2 Type 99 20mm cannons, based on the Swiss Oerlikon design, fired explosive shells that could tear apart an aircraft structure with just a few hits. The two Type 97 7.7mm machine guns, synchronized to fire through the propeller arc, provided additional firepower for close-range engagements. Japanese pilots had been trained to make every shot count, approaching to within 100 meters before opening fire, ensuring that their limited ammunition, 60 rounds per cannon and 700 rounds per machine gun, would be used effectively. But the Thach weave negated these advantages by preventing Japanese pilots from achieving the stable firing positions they needed for accurate shooting. The constant weaving motion of the American fighters, combined with the threat of defensive fire from the wingman, meant that Japanese pilots were forced to take snapshot bursts at maximum range, spraying ammunition in the hope of lucky hits rather than the carefully aimed fire they had been trained to deliver. The Zero's limited ammunition capacity, which had seemed adequate when pilots could close to point-blank range, became a critical weakness when they were forced to engage in extended battles against weaving opponents. The Wildcats' advantages, which had seemed insignificant compared to its performance disadvantages, suddenly became crucial in the context of the Thach weave. The armor plating that protected the pilot, oil cooler, and fuel tanks, which added weight and reduced performance, meant that Wildcats could absorb hits that would destroy a Zero. The self-sealing fuel tanks, which the Japanese had eliminated to save weight, prevented the catastrophic fires that claimed so many Zero pilots. The robust Pratt & Whitney R1830-86 twin Wasp engine, while less powerful than later American engines, was incredibly durable and could continue running even after taking significant damage. Most importantly, the Wildcats' radio equipment, which Japanese pilots often mocked as unnecessary weight that demonstrated American dependence on technology rather than skill, became essential for coordinating the Thach weave. American pilots could call out threats, coordinate their movements, and maintain the precise timing necessary for the weave to work effectively. Japanese pilots, many of whom flew without radios to save weight or had removed them because of poor quality, were unable to coordinate their attacks against the weaving Americans, forcing them to attack individually and falling into the trap the tactic created. The mission on August 24th ended with the loss of 3 Zeros and 1 Wildcat, a shocking reversal of the 12-to-1 kill ratios the Japanese had enjoyed in the war's early months. Sasai, nursing his damaged Zero back to Rabaul with fabric strips streaming from bullet holes in his wings, knew that something fundamental had changed in the air war over the Solomons. The Americans had found a way to neutralize the Zero's advantages not through superior technology or performance, but through a tactical innovation that turned the very nature of air combat on its head. That evening, in the officers' mess at Rabaul, the surviving pilots gathered to discuss what they had encountered. The usual boisterous confidence that characterized these gatherings was replaced by subdued conversation and worried glances. Lieutenant Yoshio Iwaki, who had barely escaped when 2 weaving Wildcats had caught him in their crossfire, suggested that they develop counter-tactics, perhaps using 3 or 4 aircraft to attack each pair of Wildcats simultaneously. But Captain Toshiyuki Yokoyama, the senior fighter commander at Rabaul, recognized the deeper problem. The Thach weave forced Japanese pilots to abandon everything they had been taught about air combat to fight a kind of battle for which they had never trained. The impact extended beyond the immediate tactical level to strike at the heart of Japanese military philosophy. The concept of the decisive battle, the Kantai Kessen, which had governed Japanese naval thinking since the victory over Russia at Tsushima in 1905, assumed that superior training and warrior spirit would overcome material disadvantages. The Zero had been designed as the ultimate expression of this philosophy, sacrificing everything for performance to create a fighter that would dominate through sheer capability. But the Thach weave demonstrated that tactical innovation could neutralize technological superiority, that teamwork could defeat individual skill, that American pragmatism could overcome Japanese spiritual strength. Commander Minoru Genda, the tactical genius who had planned the Pearl Harbor attack and was now serving on Admiral Yamamoto's staff, received the after-action reports from Guadalcanal with growing concern. Genda understood that if American pilots flying inferior aircraft could achieve parity or even superiority through tactical innovation, What would happen when they received better fighters? The reports of new American aircraft in development, the Vought F-4U Corsair and the Grumman F-6F Hellcat, suggested that the United States would soon field fighters that matched or exceeded the Zero's performance while retaining the armor, firepower, and structural strength that made American aircraft so difficult to destroy. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The production implications were equally troubling. The Mitsubishi factory at Nagoya was producing approximately 120 Zeros per month in mid-1942, with each aircraft requiring approximately 8,000 man-hours to complete. The workers, many of them women who had replaced men called to military service, approached their task with religious devotion, understanding that the aircraft they built were the sword and shield of the empire. They carefully applied 16 coats of paint to each Zero, sanded between each coat to achieve a mirror-smooth finish that would reduce drag and increase speed. They drilled lightning holes wherever possible to reduce weight, sometimes removing metal until the structure was barely strong enough to withstand flight loads. But this craftsmanship approach to aircraft production meant that Japan could never match American industrial output. The Grumman factory at Bethpage, New York, was already producing 200 Wildcats per month, and General Motors' Eastern Aircraft Division, which had taken over Wildcat production to free Grumman for Hellcat development, was ramping up to produce even more. These aircraft were built on assembly lines using automotive mass production techniques, with workers who might have been building Buicks 6 months earlier now riveting together fighter planes. The Americans had turned aircraft production into an industrial process, while the Japanese still treated it as an art. The strategic implications of the Thach weave extended far beyond the immediate tactical situation over Guadalcanal. If American pilots could defend themselves effectively against Zero attacks, they could protect their bomber and torpedo aircraft, which were the real ship killers in naval warfare. If Japanese fighters couldn't quickly eliminate American combat air patrols, Japanese carriers would be vulnerable to counterattack. If the Zero's psychological impact, its reputation for invincibility, was broken, American pilots would become more aggressive, more willing to engage even when outnumbered. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the commander-in-chief of the combined fleet, had warned before the war that Japan could run wild for 6 months or a year. But after that, I have utterly no confidence. The Thach weave suggested that the period of running wild might be ending sooner than even Yamamoto had feared. The battle for Guadalcanal, which the Japanese had initially dismissed as a minor operation to recapture an airfield, was becoming a meat grinder that was consuming Japan's most precious resource: experienced pilots. The pilot training program at Kasumigara Naval Air Training Center, which had produced the world's finest naval aviators, required 2 years to transform a recruit into a combat-ready fighter pilot. The program included 300 hours of flight time, extensive aerobatic training, gunnery practice with live ammunition, formation flying, navigation exercises, and combat tactics. The washout rate was severe, with only 10% of candidates earning their wings. This selective process had created an elite cadre of pilots who were arguably the best in the world at individual air combat. But this excellence came at a price. Japan simply couldn't produce enough pilots to replace combat losses, especially when those losses were accelerating due to tactical innovations like the Thach weave. The American training program, while initially producing pilots with less individual skill than their Japanese counterparts, could generate far more pilots in less time. American pilots were arriving at combat units with 200 to 300 hours of flight time, less than their Japanese opponents, but enough to execute tactics like the Thach weave effectively. And unlike the Japanese, who kept their best pilots in combat until they died, the Americans rotated experienced pilots home to serve as instructors, spreading combat knowledge throughout the training establishment. The maintenance situation was equally problematic. The Zero's Nakajima Sakai engine required careful maintenance and adjustment to perform properly. The engine's 14 cylinders had to be perfectly synchronized, the supercharger carefully tuned, the fuel mixture adjusted for different altitudes. Japanese mechanics at forward bases like Rabaul worked miracles keeping their aircraft operational, but they were fighting a losing battle against wear, combat damage, and the corrosive effects of the tropical climate. Meanwhile, American mechanics, many trained in Detroit's auto factories, approached aircraft maintenance with the same systematic efficiency they had applied to keeping production lines running. By September 1942, the full impact of the Thach weave was becoming apparent in the skies over Guadalcanal. Marine Fighting Squadron 223, led by Major John Smith, was achieving kill ratios that would have seemed impossible just months earlier. On September 10th, Smith himself shot down 3 Zeros while flying in a Thach weave formation with his wingman, Second Lieutenant Robert E. Gaylor. The Japanese pilots, from the elite Tainan Air Group, had attacked with their usual aggressive tactics, only to find themselves trapped in the crossfire between the two weaving Wildcats. The psychological impact on Japanese pilots was devastating. Lieutenant Hiroshi Nishizawa, who would become Japan's leading ace with 87 claimed victories, wrote in his diary about encountering the Thach weave for the first time. The Americans have changed the rules of combat. They no longer fight as individuals seeking glory, but as a machine that grinds forward regardless of personal honor. We dive on them, expecting them to flee, and instead they turn toward us with their guns firing. It is like fighting an enemy who does not fear death but also does not seek it, who has found a middle path we do not understand. The Thach weave also exposed fundamental weaknesses in Japanese fighter doctrine that had been masked by the Zero's performance advantages. Japanese pilots had been trained to achieve victory through superior position and aggressive attack, pressing home their assaults until the enemy was destroyed. This approach worked well against opponents who fought the same way, engaging in turning battles where the Zero's superior maneuverability guaranteed victory. But against the Thach weave, aggressive attacks simply led Japanese pilots deeper into the trap, exposing them to defensive fire from unexpected angles. The fuel situation added another layer of complexity to the problem. The Zero's exceptional range, achieved through careful engine management and auxiliary fuel tanks, meant that Japanese pilots could remain over Guadalcanal for up to 2 hours, far longer than the Wildcats could stay airborne. But the Thach weave battles consumed fuel at a prodigious rate, with pilots running their engines at maximum power while maneuvering violently to avoid defensive fire. Many Japanese pilots found themselves forced to disengage not because they were losing the battle, but because they lacked the fuel to continue fighting and still make it back to Rabaul. Lieutenant Commander Tadashi Nakajima, who had taken over leadership of the Tainan Air Group after Commander Saito was wounded, tried various tactics to counter the Thach weave. He experimented with high-speed slashing attacks from altitude, hoping to hit the Wildcats before they could begin weaving. He tried coordinated multiplane attacks, sending 4 or 6 Zeros against each pair of Wildcats. He even attempted to use the Zero's superior range to wait until the Wildcats were low on fuel before attacking, but each approach had limited success, and losses continued to mount. The problem was that the Thach weave was not just a defensive tactic, but a complete system of mutual support that could be adapted to different situations. When attacked from high altitude, the weaving fighters would turn toward each other while climbing, maintaining their mutual support while gaining altitude. When outnumbered, they would tighten their weave, reducing the separation between aircraft to create a more concentrated defensive fire. When low on fuel or ammunition, one fighter could break for home while the other provided cover, then reverse roles once the first aircraft was clear. The American pilots who executed the Thach weave were undergoing their own psychological transformation. Ensign Charles Red Marg of VF-5, who had arrived at Guadalcanal, convinced he would die facing the legendary Zero, discovered that the weave gave him a confidence he had never expected. In a letter to his father in Ohio, he wrote, "The Japs aren't supermen, Dad. They're good pilots flying good planes, but we've figured out how to beat them. When my wingman and I start our weave, I know we're going to survive. It's like having a guardian angel watching your tail, except the angel has 650 caliber machine guns." The mechanical reliability of the Wildcat, initially seen as less important than performance, became crucial in the extended battles created by the Thach weave. The Pratt and Whitney R-1830 engine, while producing only 1,200 horsepower compared to the Sakai's 1,130 horsepower, could maintain that power output even after taking damage that would have destroyed the more delicate Japanese engine. Bullet holes in the cylinders, oil leaks, damaged cooling fins, the Twin Wasp would keep running, getting its pilot home when a Zero would have been forced down. The evolution of the Thach weave continued throughout the Guadalcanal campaign as pilots refined the tactic based on combat experience. Captain Marion Carl of VMF 223, who would become the Marine Corps' first ace, developed what he called the vertical scissors, adding altitude changes to the basic weave pattern. When a Zero attacked from above, Carl and his wingman would not only turn toward each other, but also alternate climbing and diving, creating a three-dimensional weave that was even harder for Japanese pilots to counter. The impact on Japanese naval planning was profound. The Operation Igo reinforcement of Rabaul in October 1942 brought 170 additional aircraft, including 45 Zero fighters from the carriers Shokaku and Zuikaku. These were elite pilots, many veterans of Pearl Harbor and the Indian Ocean raids, yet they too found themselves frustrated by the Thach weave. Lieutenant Commander Shigeru Itaya, who had led the first wave of fighters over Pearl Harbor, was shot down on October 25th when he pressed an attack against two weaving Wildcats and flew directly into the concentrated fire of their 12 machine guns. The loss of experienced pilots like Itaya was irreplaceable. Each veteran represented not just combat skill but institutional knowledge, years of experience that couldn't be taught in training schools. The Japanese Navy had started the war with approximately 3,000 trained naval aviators, including 1,500 fighter pilots. By November 1942, losses at Coral Sea, Midway, and Guadalcanal had reduced this number by nearly 30%. The pilots being rushed through abbreviated training programs to replace them had neither the skill nor the experience to cope with tactical innovations like the Thach weave. The maintenance crews at Henderson Field, working under constant bombardment from Japanese naval guns and bombers, performed their own miracles, keeping Wildcats operational. Unlike the Japanese mechanics who had to hand-fit parts and improvise repairs, American mechanics had access to standardized components that could be swapped quickly between aircraft. A damaged engine could be replaced in hours rather than days. Battle damage that would have grounded a Zero for weeks could be repaired overnight. This maintainability meant that even though the Marines had fewer aircraft than the Japanese, they could keep a higher percentage operational. The intelligence war was equally important. The Japanese had almost no information about the Thach weave before encountering it in combat. Their intelligence services had focused on technical specifications, engine performance, and armament, missing the tactical innovations that would prove far more important than raw performance numbers. Meanwhile, American intelligence, aided by coast watchers in the Solomon Islands and code-breaking efforts that revealed Japanese operational plans, allowed Marine pilots to know when attacks were coming and prepare their defenses accordingly. By November 1942, the Thach weave had become so effective that Japanese bomber crews began refusing to fly missions to Guadalcanal without massive fighter escorts. The Mitsubishi G-4M bombers, which the Japanese called Hamaki, cigar, for their cylindrical fuselage, and which American pilots had nicknamed flying lighters for their tendency to burst into flames when hit, were particularly vulnerable. Their long range came at the cost of armor and self-sealing fuel tanks, making them easy prey for Wildcats that had survived their fighter escorts using the Thach weave. The tactical success of the Thach weave influenced American aircraft design philosophy. The F-6F Hellcat, which would enter combat in late 1943, was designed not to outturn the Zero, but to defeat it through superior speed, climb rate, and firepower. The designers at Grumman understood that the Thach weave had proven that tactics could overcome performance disadvantages, so they focused on creating an aircraft that would enhance tactical flexibility rather than pure maneuverability. The Hellcat's 2,000 horsepower engine, 6 50 caliber machine guns, and robust construction would make it the perfect platform for aggressive tactics that built on the defensive foundation the Thach weave had established. Lieutenant Saburo Sakai, Japan's leading surviving ace who would end the war with 64 confirmed victories, encountered the Thach weave in November 1942 during a sweep over Guadalcanal. Despite his exceptional skill and experience, he found himself unable to achieve a clean shot on the weaving Wildcats. In his post-war memoir, he wrote, "It was like trying to catch smoke with your hands. Every time you thought you had them, they would slip away, and suddenly you would find their guns bearing on you." We had been trained to think of aerial combat as a duel between warriors. The Americans had turned it into a team sport where individual excellence meant nothing. The Japanese tried various countermeasures to defeat the Thach weave. They experimented with using their superior altitude performance to attack from angles the Wildcats couldn't reach. They tried using decoy aircraft to draw the Wildcats into breaking their formation. They even attempted to ram the American fighters in desperation, trading their lives for kills. But each approach had limited success, and the fundamental problem remained. The Thach weave forced Japanese pilots to fight on American terms, negating the advantages that had made the Zero dominant. The cultural implications of the Thach weave's success were perhaps even more significant than its tactical impact. Japanese military culture, rooted in Bushido and the samurai tradition, emphasized individual warrior spirit and personal honor. The concept of achieving victory through mutual support rather than individual excellence was foreign to Japanese thinking. It suggested that the American approach to war, based on industrial efficiency and systematic problem-solving rather than warrior tradition, might ultimately prove superior. Commander Minoru Genda, reflecting on the failure to counter the Thach weave, would later write, "We had designed the perfect fighter and trained the perfect pilots, but the Americans had developed the perfect tactic. They had found a way to make our strengths irrelevant and our weaknesses fatal. It was not a failure of courage or skill, but of imagination. We could not conceive of pilots who would deliberately avoid individual combat in favor of mutual protection." The production situation continued to deteriorate for Japan throughout 1942. The Mitsubishi and Nakajima factories were struggling to maintain quality while increasing quantity. The special aluminum alloys that gave the Zero its exceptional strength-to-weight ratio were becoming scarce. Skilled workers were being drafted into the military, replaced by teenagers and women who lacked experience. Meanwhile, American production was accelerating. Grumman delivered 1,439 F-4F Wildcats in 1942, while General Motors' Eastern Aircraft Division was tooling up to produce thousands more. The pilot training crisis deepened as well. By December 1942, the Japanese Navy was reducing training time from 2 years to 18 months, then to 1 year. Flying hours were cut from 300 to 200, then to 150. Aerobatic training, once the centerpiece of the program, was reduced to basic maneuvers. Gunnery practice was limited by ammunition shortages. Formation flying, essential for coordinated attacks, was abbreviated. The new pilots arriving at Rabaul in late 1942 were skilled enough to fly the Zero, but lacked the experience to cope with sophisticated tactics like the Thach weave. The Americans, conversely, were expanding their training programs exponentially. The Naval Air Training Command had established new facilities across the southern United States, taking advantage of good weather and open spaces. Pilots were receiving 300 to 400 hours of flight training, including 50 hours in type. They practiced the Thach weave until it became instinctive, flying mock combats against instructors who had faced Zeros in actual combat. By the time they reached the Pacific, they were prepared for the reality of fighting the Zero. The impact of the Thach weave extended beyond fighter-versus-fighter combat. Torpedo and dive bomber crews began using similar mutual support tactics, with aircraft covering each other during attack runs. Even B-17 Flying Fortress crews in the Solomon Islands adopted weaving patterns during their bomb runs, making it harder for Zeros to achieve stable firing positions. The principle of mutual support through coordinated maneuvering was proving applicable across different types of aerial warfare. The Japanese Naval General Staff in Tokyo received increasingly alarming reports from the front. The kill ratios that had been 12-1 in Japan's favor during the war's first 6 months were now approaching parity. At Guadalcanal, American pilots were actually achieving positive kill ratios despite flying inferior aircraft. The reports emphasized that this was not due to any decline in Japanese pilot skill or courage, but rather to a tactical innovation that fundamentally changed the nature of air combat. Admiral Yamamoto, who had opposed war with America but now found himself conducting it, understood the implications better than most. In a private letter to Navy Minister Shimada, he wrote, "The Americans have discovered that war is not about individual heroism, but about systems and methods. While we perfect the warrior, they perfect the means of defeating warriors. Each zero we lose takes 2 years to replace considering pilot training. Each wildcat they lose is replaced in weeks, with a pilot who needs only to master their simple but effective tactics." By January 1943, the evacuation of Japanese forces from Guadalcanal marked not just a strategic defeat, but the end of the Zero's psychological dominance. The aircraft that had seemed invincible a year earlier was now vulnerable to an inferior fighter flown by pilots using superior tactics. The Thach weave had proven that technological advantage could be neutralized by tactical innovation, that teamwork could overcome individual excellence, that American pragmatism could defeat Japanese spiritualism. The legacy of the Thach weave would extend far beyond World War II. The principle of mutual support through coordinated maneuvering would become fundamental to fighter tactics worldwide. In Korea, F-86 Sabre pilots would use variations of the weave against MiG-15 seconds. In Vietnam, F-4 Phantom crews would employ similar tactics against more maneuverable MiG-17 seconds and MiG-21 seconds. Even in the modern era of beyond visual range missiles and stealth technology, the basic concept of mutual support that Thach developed with matchsticks on a table remains central to fighter employment. Lieutenant Commander John Smith Thach himself would continue to refine and teach his tactics throughout the war. Promoted to captain and given command of Air Group 5, he would lead his pilots in the Marshalls, Marianas, and Philippine campaigns. His tactical innovations would save countless American lives and contribute significantly to the defeat of Japanese air power. After the war, he would rise to admiral, always emphasizing that the weave was not his personal invention but the product of systematic analysis and team effort. The Japanese pilots who survived encounters with the Thach weave carried the psychological scars for the rest of their lives. Many spoke of a moment of revelation when they realized that everything they had been taught about air combat was wrong, that their years of training had prepared them for a kind of war that no longer existed. The Zero, which had represented the pinnacle of Japanese aeronautical achievement, had been defeated not by a superior aircraft, but by 2 inferior fighters working together. The workers at the Mitsubishi and Nakajima factories continued building Zeros until the war's end, producing 10,937 aircraft in total. But the later variants, weighted down with armor and self-sealing tanks in response to tactics like the Thach weave, had lost the ethereal performance that had made the original Zero special. They were compromised designs, neither possessing the Zero's original advantages nor adequately addressing its vulnerabilities. The final irony was that the Thach weave worked precisely because it abandoned traditional fighter tactics. Instead of trying to outfly the Zero, American pilots had found a way to make flying skill irrelevant. Instead of engaging in the romantic individual combat that both Japanese and American pilots had imagined, they had turned air fighting into a mechanical process. It was ugly, inelegant, and completely effective. Captain Joseph Foss, the Marine Corps' leading ace with 26 victories, summed up the impact of the Thach weave in a post-war interview. The Zero was a better airplane. The Japanese were arguably better natural pilots. But Thach gave us a way to win anyway. He taught us that in war, it's not about being better, it's about being effective. 2 average pilots using the weave could defeat the best pilot in the world flying alone. That's not fair, but war isn't fair. The mathematical precision of the Thach weave's success tells its own story. At the beginning of the Guadalcanal campaign in August 1942, The Zero enjoyed a kill ratio of approximately 6-1 against the Wildcat. By the campaign's end in February 1943, Wildcats were achieving a 1.5-1 ratio against Zeros. This reversal occurred without any significant improvement in the Wildcats' performance or degradation in the Zeros' capabilities. The only variable that changed was tactical employment. The human cost of this tactical revolution was staggering for Japan. Of the approximately 1,500 trained fighter pilots with which Japan started the war, fewer than 200 remained by early 1943. Many had fallen to the Thach weave, caught in the crossfire between two weaving Wildcats, unable to escape the trap their own aggression had led them into. These losses were irreplaceable. Japan could build new Zeros, but it couldn't create experienced pilots. The Thach weave represented something larger than just a fighter tactic. It was a metaphor for the entire Pacific War, demonstrating how American innovation, teamwork, and systematic problem-solving could overcome initial disadvantages. It showed that victory in modern war came not from individual excellence, but from organizational effectiveness. It proved that the side that could adapt fastest, learn from its mistakes, and implement solutions across its force would ultimately prevail. In the end, Lieutenant Junichi Sasai's encounter with the Thach weave on that August morning in 1942 was more than just a tactical defeat. It was the moment when the myth of the Zero's invincibility began to crumble, when Japanese pilots first realized that their enemies had found an answer to what had seemed an unsolvable problem. The simple act of two fighters turning toward each other had changed the course of the Pacific Air War. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.